We've all had that strange, terrifying dream in which we're being pursued by an inhuman yet familiar figure. Our legs won't quite let us run fast enough, and the geography of our surroundings seems to inexplicably change round every corner. But at that crucial moment when the boogeyman gets you, when he's about to murder you in a brutal, violent manner, that's when you wake up, right? But what happens if we don't wake up? And what happens if that man is about to kill us for real? By 1984, the slasher movie had begun to dissipate almost as quickly as it had exploded. As more and more formulaic imitators and sequels were being churned out, it seems audiences were growing tired. Enter horror maestro Wes Craven, who reignited the slasher by giving it a supernatural twist. What if teens were being killed off one by one by a knife-wielding murderer as usual, but this time in their nightmares? This ingenious twist on the idea meant that Craven was able to marry traditional slasher movie-style set pieces with dreamlike fantasy and surrealism, as well as create arguably the most iconic horror monster of all time. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the slasher and take a trip down Elm Street. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the evolution and history of the horror genre by delving into particular subgenres across a number of weeks. We're currently in the midst of exploring the evolution of the slasher, and this is part 9. So, if you are tuning in for the first time, that means there's another 8 parts that are brilliant. So please go back and have a little listen. You can subscribe to us on iTunes. You can find us on all major podcast platforms. You can also get in touch with us. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, that's @evolutionpod, or on Facebook, that's facebook.com/evolutionofhorror. I'm very, very excited to get started this week because we are, of course, going to be talking all things A Nightmare on Elm Street, one of my absolute personal favourites. This is a spoiler warning for anyone out there who hasn't seen A Nightmare on Elm Street. I would recommend you go away and watch it, not just because I'm going to give everything away in this podcast, but also because it's really great. Honestly, it is one of the absolute must-sees of the horror genre, and you can't really call yourself a horror fan if you haven't yet watched A Nightmare on Elm Street. So go away, watch the original. I mean, you don't have to worry about the 8 sequels, and then come back and listen to the discussion. Okay, so it's time for me to introduce my guest for this week. Again, very, very excited to have him on the podcast. This is somebody who I actually grew up listening to week after week. He was somebody whose reviews and opinions I valued a lot. He was the Radio 1 film critic for several years. He's appeared in numerous other TV outlets, radio outlets. He's done Wit-Tainment, he's done podcasts, he's been on other TV shows. He's everywhere, this guy, basically. It's hard to avoid him. And he also happens to be a huge fan and somewhat of a specialist when it comes to 80s teen movies. It is my great pleasure to introduce the brilliant James King. James, welcome.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Now, I don't want to make you feel old, but this is very exciting for me because I spent a lot of my youth listening to you and listening to your reviews on Radio 1.
Yeah, and it does worry me when people say that because it's easy to forget that people were listening and that people were listening quite closely. Yeah. And that, you get some people come up to you and go, you gave a good review to this film back in, 2004.
Yeah.
And I went to see it, and it was the worst 2 hours of my life, and I still haven't forgiven you for it. And you might not even remember giving that review. I remember the key reviews but if you're doing 4 or 5 films a week, you just can't possibly remember that many.
Absolutely.
But of course, many listeners do.
Yeah.
And I suppose I was the same. If I grew up watching Jonathan Ross on film whatever year it would have been, and I remember a good review he gave and went to see the film because of that, it would stick with me. It might not stick with Jonathan Ross, but totally. It would stick with me. So Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if there was anything in particular that I said that you remember or disagreed with, but
no, it was just a general. It was one of the. It was it was a regular thing that I would listen to each week. Also, do you remember? Well, of course you remember because you did it. But I remember the channel UK Play. And you occasionally made appearances on that.
No one has ever said, I remember the channel UK Play. This is a first.
I loved UK Play.
It's a channel that was so good, it closed. I was on there with Vernon Kay, who, of course, went on to greater things. Josie Darby and Joe Mason. It's a lot of fun. We did a show called... It was originally called The Phone Zone, and it got changed to Top of the Pops at Play. It was basically like the MTV request show where people phoned up and wanted music videos. And I presented a few and talked about films on a few. But I think the worrying thing for me, when I say, it sort of surprises me when people remember what I said back in 2004, is that I started, it was my first job. My first job was at Radio 1. And, so I learned on air, basically. Yeah. And so, I was saying things that I would look back on now and think, you were talking rubbish. Or you didn't really know what you're doing. And because you can only... I'd come out of a film degree and I'd done journalism course and all this kind of stuff. So I had the qualifications on paper, but I had no experience.
Yes.
And you have to have experience. I actually think it's very difficult to be a critic until you've done 10 years, really, of practice.
It's hard. Well, absolutely. And my significant other, Rihanna, who's also been on this podcast, obviously you
I know
you
her quite well.
Her.
Yes.
You found her.
Yeah.
She took the baton.
She did. Yeah.
And again, it was that thing of, literally straight from being a student to being on air to millions of people reviewing movies. And that must be a daunting thing.
It's exciting. It's very exciting. But I don't think I was comfortable until I probably hit 30.
Yeah. Where
I felt like I had more experience than the people listening.
Yes.
And I was chosen, as was Rihanna chosen, to work at Radio 1 because we were like the listeners. We were so young. They wanted us to be like the target audience. And that's brilliant. But I think you also have to have a sort of, air of superiority. Sounds a bit snobbish. I don't quite mean it like that.
But I get what you mean. You have to have that respect as well.
Yeah, you need to know a bit more because you are an expert.
Yeah.
And, I don't think I did. I think I only did by doing it for quite a long time.
Right.
And that's why I look back on now at stuff I might have said when I was 22 or 23. And, it's not just me kind of a false modesty. It probably was rubbish. Well, and I'm sorry if you listened to it then as a kid growing up and I was talking, crap because I was just a kid as well.
But that's the thing. And also Radio 1 is a young audience. And speaking as one of your listeners who was probably about 14, I would never have noticed that you were talking rubbish.
Well,
so there you go.
I suppose when you do have a very young audience, that's the only advantage.
Relative. Yeah, exactly.
To them, I was grown up and world weary and experienced, but in my own head, I knew nothing.
Exactly. Lovely. So we've been talking these past few weeks about horror movies, particularly kind of the slasher genre, the sort of 80s slasher movement and how that came to be all the way back from sort of Hitchcock movies through sort of the Giallo and through to now, essentially. Before we get into A Nightmare on Elm Street, I just want to ask you, what's your relationship like with horror in general? Are you a big horror movie fan?
Obviously, in this job, you perhaps see more horror movies than average person on the street, whoever they may be, because you just see stuff that comes out every week. I remember someone introducing me as, he's a real horror fan, and it was because I'm friends with Mark Kermode and I know Kim Newman and Alan Jones and the kind of the big guns of British horror film criticism, and because I know them and friends with them, I sort of became, to this person who was introducing me, associated with them, and I'm in no way in their league, not even close to that. Alan runs Fright Fest. This is the ultimate. I'm just nothing like that whatsoever. So I was kind of quite chuffed to be introduced in the same breath, but that's not me. Horror is relatively interesting to me, and I like several of them, but I'm in no way a horror nerd.
Do you remember I've asked everyone this, but do you remember what your kind of introduction to horror was? Did you ever see anything as a child that scared the crap out of you? Was there ever that kind of experience?
Yeah, although I suspect they probably wouldn't entirely be classed as horror films.
Yeah.
Jaws was an early one.
Of course.
And which I mean, it's more of a thriller, really, isn't it? But then Spielberg often, he put some dark moments in his films, even though they were major mainstream.
I think you could argue it's almost like a kind of monster movie sort of formula.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and actually, a lot of Spielberg stuff, as producer and director, like Temple of Doom or Gremlins, that kind of thing. They're family films, sort of, but I mean, certainly they caused a lot of controversy when they came out because they did delve a little too much into the dark world of horror for many people's taste. So those things were what I grew up on, but I wouldn't class them as 18 certificate slasher movies. I remember probably the earliest one I remember that freaked me out is a film called The Man Who Haunted Himself, which stars Roger Moore. It was made in 1970. I actually wasn't around then. I didn't see it when it came out. But I saw it, on telly in the 80s.
Listen, just tell me the name.
What name? What are you talking about?
Is it blackmail?
Get out of here!
Listen
You're
to me.
mad!
I have a wife and 2 kids, and I want to know what's behind all this.
Again, it's a psychological thriller more than a horror film. It's about a guy whose doppelganger, whose alter ego kind of takes over his life. So there are 2 of him around. I suppose it's like a dark sliding doors or something like that. It's actually really good, though. And that really freaked me out when I was younger. Maybe because I associated Roger Moore with James Bond, and to see him play a sort of troubled character was quite intriguing to me. And the Spielberg stuff. Also, there were a run of Disney films in the 80s that got quite dark when they were attempting to be more than just... attempting to be more than just family animation. Stuff like Watcher in the Woods.
What did you see? It's not Karen outside there. It's someone else.
The Watcher in the Woods, from Walt Disney Productions. It is not a fairy tale.
Which were flops because people just didn't get it. They're like, Disney?
Who is this for?
Dark horror movies? We don't want this.
Yeah.
But they were advertised to children. I remember seeing the trailers on other films.
Me too. Other VHS, and even the trailers were scary.
Yeah.
I remember thinking, oh my God. Yeah.
I watched them and yes, they were scary.
Yeah.
They weren't Dumbo or Pinocchio.
God, and it feels like kids' movies, they're not quite as dark and scary as they used to be. I talked about this on episode 1, actually, with my co-host Rob. What's happened to the movies that my generation grew up on in the 80s, like Dark Crystal or Return to Oz and those types of movies? What's happened to that kind of a family film?
Labyrinth as well.
Labyrinth.
Yeah, I think, fairy tales obviously have a huge history of having dark psychological backgrounds to them. And I remember when I was reviewing Pan's Labyrinth, talking about that and Labyrinth, and Wizard of Oz and all these kind of things.
Yeah.
And I mean, Pan's Labyrinth isn't a kids' movie.
No.
But at the same time, it probably owed quite a lot to those kids' movies that I grew up watching.
Yeah, and actually, it's a perfect time to be talking about this because I do think, and we'll discuss this later, but A Nightmare on Elm Street, of all the slashers, it has this kind of childlike quality to it. It feels like we're telling a story with real children, and there are parts of the movie that feel like a kid's movie or a fairy tale, and Freddy Krueger as a character is this kind of, child's nightmare boogeyman type creation.
I think it's really important to, as a kid, be freaked out every now and then.
I agree.
And that's, I'm not a parent, so I admit that, but it sticks with you, and it's, I don't know, it sounds like a sort of thing my grandparents would say, but it's kind of good for you. I think I
agree. Yeah,
and that's why we can sit here now and talk about films we watched 30 years ago that freaked us out.
Yeah,
but I don't really know in 30 years' time what children are going to say
freaked them out.
Because would you say that Cars 3 freaked you out?
Exactly.
I don't think so.
It's
I mean, it's boring, but
yeah,
I don't think it freaked you out.
It's weird, isn't it? There's the odd one here, Goosebumps last year. That's the only thing I can think of that's even remotely of that kind of ilk.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a strange one. So you are currently writing a book.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what this book is about, because I think it could be quite relevant as well to what we're about to discuss.
Yes. It's a book about 80s teen movies, although it starts in the late 70s and ends in the early 90s, but the bulk of it is about the 80s. And I just wanted to write something that wasn't easy nostalgia. There's a lot of easy nostalgia about the 80s and 80s movies. You can switch on, local FM and it'll be like, all 80s nights, relive the hairdos and the shoulder pads. You think, but, there is actually something interesting and valid and even academic to say about all this stuff. It's not just let's laugh at all the funny things or just talk about the Breakfast Club endlessly. Although I do write about the Breakfast Club.
Yeah, it must be an important one, I imagine.
Of course, you can't. The most difficult chapters were the John Hughes chapters because so much has been written about it. And so much of it has been turned into easy nostalgia. Yeah. And you just think, okay, so I need to approach this from a different angle. But also I think there are a lot of things that people kind of forget about the 80s and those teen stars and those teen movies. We forget about Brooke Shields, for example. Yeah. How massive she was in the early part of the decade. And was very much a teenager, more of a teenager than a lot of the other people who pretended to be teenagers.
Yes, of course.
And it's not like her films are brilliant, but she was huge. And so, I address, stuff about her. And I think some of the things before John Hughes have been forgotten. The post 84, 85 things are very well known. Back to the Future and Ferris Bueller and things like that. Lost Boys, huge films. But there's stuff in the early 80s that people don't really talk about much. Now that we've forgotten about a little bit, like The Outsiders, like Fast Times at Ridgemont High. But these were early appearances for Sean Penn, for Tom Cruise, for Rob Lowe, the key figures, absolutely key figures. Cameron Crowe directing and Francis Coppola directing. So, they weren't just throwaway things. They were incredibly important, but they're actually quite difficult films in certain respects and quite revolutionary films in certain respects. And they're not as easy to have fun with as Back to the Future is. Yeah. So hopefully I've sort of shone the light on those a little bit as well.
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, we do seem to have, it feels like there's a real moment right now of 80s nostalgia, isn't there? We're kind of obsessed with it. If you look at things like Stranger Things and Glow and all these TV shows and all these movies, there's a real kind of almost fetishization of 80s.
Well, there was a blatancy about it, and I do think that changed as well. I think that sort of changed mid-80s. Yeah. When it became corporate. And it's funny because my editor has said, I'm still revising the book, and my editor said, okay, so I want you to be clear about whether you think, these are good or bad, or whether things changed and whether that was a good or a bad thing. And actually, things did change. The early part of the decade, the movies are different to the latter part of the decade. But I wouldn't necessarily say one is better than the other. I think they changed and they offered you different things. Yeah. And when things did become more corporate, and when Spielberg got on board, and when they started to be box office hits, they became a bit more gaudy, became a bit more blatant. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just offering us a different thing. Yeah. And you can enjoy Back to the Future and the fact that it had spin-off books and spin-off records and was this huge corporate entity just as much as you can enjoy some really low-budget indie movie. Yeah. They just offer you different things. But there was definitely a sea change, probably about 1984, 1985. And I think the things like Stranger Things, for example, riff on the kind of the Spielberg element, don't they?
Totally.
Which kind of riff on Donnie Darko, which in itself riffed on the Spielberg element as well.
It's kind of Spielberg meets Stephen King almost, isn't it? It's that kind of feel. Yeah. So what about do you? I mean, how big a deal were these kind of horror movies to this whole 80s teen boom? I mean, obviously you had absolute, literally hundreds of kind of slasher movies being churned out in the early 80s. And then obviously you've got A Nightmare on Elm Street, which in my head is kind of, I think of as the most 80s horror movie imaginable in a way,
They were a big deal. And as an author, I had to decide whether to address them or not. And I do. It's not a book about 80s horror, though, because that's a whole other thing. And so I kind of made a conscious decision not to go into it too much. Yeah,
because you end up sort of down a rabbit hole, I suppose.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, people have said it's too long already. So, to add 3 or 4 more chapters about 80s horror would be ridiculous. It would be the Encyclopedia Britannica. Yeah. So if people still know what that is.
I was going to say, that's a good 90s reference there. I like that.
But yes, of course they're important. And you look at a lot of the stars, they often appeared in these kind of movies. Not necessarily because they wanted to, but because there was a proliferation of them.
It was a job. Yeah,
it was a job. There was a lot of young actors looking for work, and so if something came up, they had to take it.
We just recently discussed Kevin Bacon's excellent turn in Friday the 13th, where he was impaled with a harpoon on a bunk bed. Classic moments.
And they might not particularly be proud of them, but they probably put food on the table.
Exactly, yeah. Well, I tell you what, let's get started. We've been talking around it for the last 10-20 minutes, so let's delve in and discuss Wes Craven's 1984 A Nightmare on Elm Street.
The kids of Elm Street don't know it yet, but something is coming to get them.
There's something out there, isn't there?
We just see cuts happen.
What did that, Lieutenant?
I don't know.
What the coroner got to say?
He's in the jar and puking since he saw it. They're gonna kill me for sure.
Did you do it?
There was somebody else there.
He was locked in a room with a girl who went in alive and came out in a rubber bag.
No one knows where it came from or who it will visit next.
Nancy? There's something wrong with you. You're imagining things.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Do you believe in the boogeyman?
No.
Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
Well, it's about a group of teenagers. I don't need to tell you where. The street name is in the title. Who are finding themselves tormented in their dreams by a figure wearing a red and dark green stripy sweater and a hat with knives on his gloves. It's one glove actually, isn't it? It's not both hands.
One, yeah,
it's just
right.
one glove, like Michael Jackson.
Yes, exactly.
What they discover is that what happens in the dreams, if they are attacked in the dreams, then that they are attacked in real life, and if they die in the dreams, they die in real life. And so they're trying to find out who this guy is and why it's happening to them. In case you haven't seen it, I won't tell you why it's happening to them and who this guy is.
Although actually, we do go into spoilers on this.
In that case, it's because he was a child killer from back in their parents' day when they were younger, and the parents of Elm Street all got together and actually killed this guy, Freddy Krueger, or Fred Krueger as he's known in the first one.
Yes.
And so now Fred Krueger is taking his revenge on the children of these people who killed him, and doing so in their dreams.
That opening scene where we just have this kind of smaller frame, it's kind of a box almost, a frame within a frame, and we see just this hand, or just this pair of hands, prepare this glove. It's kind of dirty and scuzzy, and you've got this feeling like you're watching something you shouldn't be. I remember just that opening image before we'd even really seen anything happen yet, but just this man building this glove and the kind of heavy breathing and that foreboding 80s music. I was terrified when I first watched this. I was probably too young to be watching it, but I was terrified. What about you? Do you remember the first time you watched this movie?
It would be on video. I watched it, and I was certainly underage.
Yep.
Such was the joy
As
of
we
the
all
video.
were. Yep.
I don't know who rented it for me then, but whoever they should be punished. I was probably about 11 or 12.
Yeah.
And I think I watched it with my friend Adam. Now, Adam is quite interesting because he's now amongst other things, he's a scientist, but he's a presenter on Radio 4, presents science programs.
Oh, wow.
And was a scientific advisor on Ex Machina.
Oh,
Alex Garland's movie, Alex Garland's movie. And I did a chat with Alex Garland, and Adam had contacted him. I'm not massively in touch with Adam now, but Adam had contacted Alex Garland before, and he said, "Tell James, remind him about how we used to watch the Nightmare on Elm Street movies when we were far too young."
Oh, brilliant!
Which Alex Garland really appreciated. I think he was a fan.
Yeah.
And so it was with my friend Adam when we were both about 11 or 12, and I think we devoured the first 3 in quite a short space of time. I didn't watch them after that. My interest in them was fleeting, but they were churned out, I think, 1 a year. So there was, and I probably would have been about 1985, 86. So there were a couple already out there.
Yeah, they
for
really
me to catch up with.
Yeah.
And then I remember watching the third one, Dream Warriors, and then just had enough for a while. I returned to them later on in the series, but the first 3 were the ones that I really went for.
I think that's a good place to stop, actually, after Dream Warriors.
Dream Warriors I liked.
It's great.
The Freddy's Revenge I wasn't so bothered about.
No.
But I had a massive crush on Nancy. Probably still do. And she's back in Dream Warriors, and I liked the kind of the hospital setting, and they really play on the, you mustn't fall asleep in that one.
It was great. Really good.
So, I probably ended on a high.
Nice. Yeah, I would agree. Definitely. It's all downhill from that one. So let's talk briefly about the cast then, and start with maybe, Heather Langenkamp, who plays Nancy. She, according to IMDb at least, she beat 200 other actresses for the part, including Jennifer Grey and Demi Moore and Courtney Cox as well.
Yeah.
Incredible. I mean, do you think this was well deserved? Did you think she puts in a good performance?
I do. I mean, looking back on them now, the movies, they sometimes seem a little bit daytime TV soap opera. Not the horror elements. I think Wes Craven is amazing at the horror elements, but the other just drama elements.
Yeah.
And certainly Nancy, played by Heather, has a relationship with her mother. Her mother's a sort of alcoholic in the first one, and it does all feel a bit 80s daytime soap.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of the strength. Maybe that's why they were so successful, because Nancy was kind of had her issues and was quite down to earth, and Heather didn't look like Demi Moore. She had a more sort of normal approach, and maybe that's why they were successful. But I think all these years later, that does show up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
That's maybe a limitation. But if Demi Moore had done it, it would have been a very different movie. She'd have been a lot feistier and tougher, whereas Heather has a vulnerability about her.
Yeah, I would agree, definitely. And also she so often in these movies it feels like the teenagers are played by sort of 30-year-olds, and she felt young, in a good way. Like it was...
I mean, there's. I mean, she was quite experienced as an actor, but the whole thing they do feel like novices. They do, they're not really polished, are they?
This is just a dream. This isn't real. This is just a dream. He isn't real.
What was your reaction then? So when you did first see it at that age, did you find it scary?
I think I found it scary. But I just watched it for the gore. That's what you wanted to watch it for. You just wanted, and you wanted each one to be more gory. You just wanted it to be more ridiculous and more bloodthirsty. That wasn't really any great artistic desire from me, age 12. I just wanted to see as the most disgusting things I could, and then to tell my mates about it, because you weren't meant to be watching it.
Absolutely.
I think that they probably realised that. I think that the sort of dramatic creativity went out of the window a little bit in the drive just to make them more and more disgusting and gory.
Definitely, yeah. It's so funny because the amount of people that I know that kind of, they all say that they first were introduced to these films obviously when you're underage, but it's weird because at the same time I couldn't imagine people that were legally old enough to watch these films particularly loving them. It almost feels like they're designed for kids or teenagers, you know. And
I think a lot of videos, not that this was made straight to video, these were big box office hits, but they knew that there was a huge ancillary market in videos and would make a lot of money from video. And a lot of movies, I think, realised that the people who would be watching them on video, sex comedies as well, that okay, well, if you were 18, well, you're probably in a relationship anyway.
Yeah,
it's not quite so exciting just to see, some naked bodies.
Yeah.
But if you're 12, it's like, oh my God.
Best thing ever.
So I think, although they would never officially admit that they were being made for an audience much younger than the certificate they were given, I think that filmmakers realised that.
Yeah.
Wake up! Are you there?
Let's carry on with the cast, because there's another key notable cast member as well, playing Nancy's boyfriend, Glenn. Johnny Depp.
Yes. One of the sexiest names ever, isn't it? Glenn.
Glenn.
Yeah. Hi, 20 Glens.
Glenn in his like sleeveless sweaters that he wears.
Yeah, he's very. Yeah, I know. He's very. Yeah, he does a tank top, doesn't he?
Yeah,
Glenn?
he does.
He's very preppy. I think it was Johnny Depp's first role, wasn't it?
It was. It was.
And it's funny because I was reading something that claimed because Glenn is so unlike Johnny Depp. Johnny Depp, even at this stage of his career, was a rock and roller and, a bad boy. But because Glenn is so preppy and so completely the opposite, it claimed that it was like an early example of Johnny Depp and his method acting and playing someone utterly removed from who he was, as we would see later on in a whole score of movies. I'm not sure whether I buy that. I think he's just playing what he was told to play, and it's his first movie and he just needed the money.
Yeah, totally.
I don't think there's any great method to the whole thing. It is interesting to see him play someone clean cut and preppy, and I think actually in the script he was even more so. But Johnny Depp can't be a 6 foot blonde guy, so he does bring with him a certain sort of oddness. But he looks a little out of his depth, I would say. He looks a little wide-eyed.
Yeah.
It's fine, and he's clearly got screen presence and very good looking and all the things we know about Johnny Depp. But I don't think it's kind of up there with Ed Wood or something. It's
absolutely.
It's quite a novelty now to watch him because he just looks a bit startled by the whole thing.
Yeah, it's true. It's like we were saying, all of them, they all look a bit green, don't they?
So what do you dream?
Forget it, Tina. The point is that everyone has a bad dream once in a while. It's no biggie.
Yeah, next time you have one, just tell yourself that's all it is, right where you're having it, Once you do that, you wake right up. At least it works for me.
They're quite likeable, at least those main two, at least Heather and Johnny. At least they're quite likeable people that you at least want to root for. You don't necessarily want to die, and that's quite a good thing for a movie like this.
Yeah, and I think there's a key scene where he's trying to blag to his mum down the phone that he's elsewhere, and he's playing a tape of sound effects down the phone to
on
try
this
and make
giant boom box.
Yeah. And I'm not saying he does it brilliantly, but I think in terms of his character, it's quite important just to show a light-hearted side to them and a cheekiness to them, so you do like him a bit more.
It worked like a charm.
Smooth.
And of course, the other two, Tina and I've forgotten what her boyfriend is called.
Rod. Yeah.
They're sort of at it. They're a bit more dirty and a bit more rebellious, whereas Glenn and Nancy seem a bit sweeter.
I think that's right, yeah. And when you look at our four main characters there, you have what, on paper, the four archetypes, really, of the slasher. You've got Nancy, who is this pure, virginal final girl. You've got Tina, who, like you say, she's at it. She's a little bit more sexually active. She's a little bit more promiscuous. She's blonde, and she is, of course, the one who dies first. And you've got her badly behaved boyfriend, who also meets a sticky end. So you've got these kind of archetypes, but I think what makes these different, like we just mentioned, they have this innocence about them, all of them. And even though Tina and Rod, yes, they have a little bit more of that Friday the 13th-ness to them, where they are loudly going at it in an upstairs bedroom, there's actually these other moments, like Tina in that opening scene where she wakes up in a panic and calls for her mum, and Nancy, she's lying in a little single bed and she gets scared and she clutches her crucifix. Or Glenn, when he's chilling in his room with his headphones on and watching TV, and his mum comes up and sort of says goodnight to him. You've got all these moments, these little character moments where I think, these are actual 17 or 18-year-olds. When you look at Friday the 13th or even Halloween, where they're babysitting and they're out and about and they're smoking joints and they're doing their own thing, yes, of course, there are a lot of teenagers that do that, but I think what we see here in Nightmare on Elm Street is way more common. These are real teenagers. These are literally kids that are on the cusp of childhood and adulthood we're seeing here. And I think that's really interesting, and it adds to the whole creepiness and, menace of this movie.
But then it's also interesting to me that it's essentially the parents' fault.
Yeah.
Why the whole thing is happening is because of what they did. And so it becomes a movie about kids. I suppose kids knowing more than their parents. The parents don't necessarily believe them that this is happening all over again. And the kids are just mopping up the mess that their parents made all those years ago.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of championing teenagers over their elders. And so you could say, well, all right, it's punishing teenagers for being a bit rebellious and wanting to have sex the whole time. But at the same time, I think it's celebrating teenagers as being smarter than their parents and their elders.
Absolutely, and that feels like a real quintessential 80s thing to me. That is something that, again, this is why I feel like this movie is almost the definitive 80s movie. When you look at some of those other movies that we were talking about earlier, The Breakfast Club and Back to the Future even, where you've got this feeling that kids are more in the know, they're more savvy than their parents. Kids have to clean up after their parents' mess, essentially. And that's totally here and that's totally present in this. I mean, the 80s is generally thought of as the golden era of teen movies. You know, you've got John Hughes and you've got all of those kind of knockabout comedies, and then you've also got all of these teen slasher movies. You know, it felt like whatever the genre, you had young people starring in them. What was it about the 80s, do you think, that tapped into something with young people? Why was there such an abundance of 80s teen movies?
Well, there's a book coming out about that fairly soon. I think it's a number of reasons. A very basic reason that goes back before Nightmare on Elm Street, but Nightmare on Elm Street follows it up, is that there are a lot of younger filmmakers coming through and younger executives as well, bosses in charge of studios. The baby boom generation who, were probably late 20s when they were getting into great positions of power.
Yeah.
And so they were naturally wanted to make younger movies.
Yeah.
Because they were younger.
Yeah.
And you'd also have a lot of directors, and actually Spielberg fits into this. Wes Craven was, I suspect, not a huge amount of age difference between them.
No.
They lived through an era where you got the first kind of fetishization of teenage life. So the 60s, late 50s and 60s, that was their teenage years. And so now all of a sudden they're filmmakers and they're thinking, what was the greatest time in my life? I know, it's when I was a teenager. I want to make a movie about young people again, and make a movie about teenagers again. And so I think that's why a lot of directors and writers were interested in writing movies about teenagers, because they were reliving their own teenage years. John Hughes is a great example of that, who never really left his teenage years. He was a fan of the Beatles, a fan of the swinging 60s when he grew up. And so he wanted to recreate that in his movies, albeit in an 80s setting.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
So much of it is to do with age, how old people were, what they think back to, and how that inspires them to write. One of the interviews I did was with David Putnam, who basically said, there was all these filmmakers that I was working with who were my age in the 70s and the 80s. We all grew up around the same time. We all remember rock and roll. We all remember the Beatles. We all remember just this great era of freedom for being a teenager. So that's what we're going to make movies about.
That's really interesting, and it makes perfect sense. And actually, when it comes to horror, and this movie in particular, where you're kind of blaming the parents, I think what struck me about it, what kind of I thought about when watching it this most recent time is, okay, this was 1984. This was about 18 years-ish after the sort of late 60s Summer of Love period. So, like you said, we had this generation who were really the first generation to celebrate being teenagers, pop music and drugs and rock and roll and hippies and this kind of thing. And what we're seeing, I think, as well, is the kind of result, is the bad result of what the 60s produced. So, we had a lot of this in the 70s as well. And people talk about things like Charlie Manson, the Manson family, the Vietnam War, and other elements that were kind of the bad side, the dark side of the 60s. What all of this free love and liberalism resulted in. And it feels like there's a little bit of that here as well. It feels like, Wes Craven in the early 70s made this movie, Last House on the Left, that was all very much about that current generation of, oh my God, what are we doing to the world? We are all destroying each other. This is the most brutal, nihilistic world imaginable, and I'm going to make the most brutal, nihilistic movie imaginable. And now it feels like Wes Craven is doing a film about, okay, what happened when all of that generation that fucked up had kids, and now the kids have got to deal with it. So there's a really interesting connection in two different ways there, in sort of positive and negative, I think, between teenagers in the 80s and their parents who were teenagers in the 60s.
Fred Krueger, Mom. Fred Krueger. Do you know who that is, Mother? Because if you do, you better tell me, because he's after me now.
And Wes Craven also is somebody that I feel like he doesn't just make scary movies that are just about scaring you. A lot of the time it feels like there's more to them than that, you know, there may be something that taps into something going on at the time or something that scares him. And there have been stories, obviously, I think real sort of news stories that inspired him about children dying in their sleep and all of that kind of thing. I mean, do you kind of see any more to this film than just what's on the surface level? Do you think there's more to it going on there that Wes Craven kind of wanted to get across?
Well, yeah, I do. I think it's fairly obvious, but that's not a bad thing. It works because it's obvious, and it's obvious because we all have to go to sleep. We all dream.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's a universal fear.
Yeah.
To not be able to go to sleep and to not dream, and to have someone, you know, attacking you in your dreams.
Yeah.
That's what's so brilliant about it, is that, yes, it's fantastical, and it's more fantastical than Halloween. It's more fantastical than Friday the 13th because it has all this fantasy stuff about it. But ultimately, it's probably the most universal and down-to-earth of all of those slasher movies, because everybody gets tired and has to go to sleep. And so it's one of the most basic things we do. And so if you turn that into something scary, everybody who watches that film is going to go, oh my God,
yeah.
what's going to happen when I go to sleep tonight?
Yeah, it's really a brilliant premise, isn't
it? Yeah, but it's so simple, it's so obvious.
Yeah.
But it's brilliant.
Yeah, it is. And you really feel it in that second half when Nancy is desperately trying to keep herself awake and she's drinking coffee, and you feel that, you know, with her, don't you? It's really clever.
Yeah. And I think especially teenagers as well, you know, teenagers...
Yes, need more sleep.
They need their sleep. They love their beds.
Yeah.
You know, they just want to... And so when you see a big death scene like Glenn's death scene on the bed, and the bed is just turned into this sort of volcano of blood, it's like, oh my God, but that's the bed. I feel like a few hours earlier he was on there listening to his music, watching his TV. That's the teenager's space. That's their place of comfort.
Yeah.
And Wes Craven has turned it into your nightmare.
That's also reflected in the way that Nancy's parents are with her, I think, as well. It's like she's in a living nightmare because no grown-ups are believing her either. She can't even run to her parents for help. They kind of dismiss her, and they put bars on her windows, and they literally kind of lock her in this nightmare. It is every child's nightmare, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and I suppose that's what makes it perhaps more of a teen movie than some of the other films, although they were being consumed by teenagers, these slasher movies. This one really is about teenagers ganging together.
Yes.
You know, the Breakfast Club with blood.
Yeah, exactly. And you're right, you know, compared to things like Halloween and all those other ones that are fairly bog standard in comparison, I think he got to be really imaginative and have some really great sort of creative flourishes, especially in this first movie. I mean, what are kind of some of the highlights for you in terms of some of these sort of dream set pieces?
Yeah, those are the best bits, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's Wes Craven excels himself and his art directors and you know, lighting people, camera people. That's where they really go to town. I love the fact that Freddy was originally killed in a boiler room, and so we often return to that in the dreams. This industrial setting, very shadowy, dripping water, lots of smoke.
Because every single death scene took place in a dream, he could do whatever the hell he wanted. He didn't have to rely on, how this axe might swing into this head and how it could be a surprise and how we could do it differently for the umpteenth time, which is what every Friday the 13th director at this point was having to figure out. He could literally dream up his scariest but most creative way imaginable to kill people off, and he did it. So you've got, as you mentioned, Johnny Depp's Glenn, who is sucked into the bed, disappears into his mattress, that safe space for teenagers, and his innards are spewed out. And obviously it's a ridiculous amount of blood that comes out of there, but it's just so perfect.
Please, God.
This is God.
I think actually I think it's the first death, isn't it? Tina's death when she's on the ceiling.
God,
that's impressive.
Amazing.
It gets really good when they sort of cut the music. The music I think is dated in the first film, but it's in there and it gets very histrionic and she's flying about. And then the music goes and all of a sudden it just becomes a lot more powerful.
Watch this.
But it's so well done because, as you mentioned, the dream sequence is very dreamlike. You've got that incredible moment where he's stood in the alley and his arms are stretched out, and the way that she kind of tries to run away from him, and then he chases her. He cuts off his fingers, and then green slime comes out, and then he peels off his own face, and there's like a skeleton underneath it. So you've got all this stuff that is so, out of this world, dreamlike, child's nightmare. Then the music cuts out and we suddenly see what's really happening to Tina, and suddenly it's like we're back in a 70s Wes Craven movie. It's suddenly so gritty, so gory, so disturbing as this girl is dragged in her nightdress up the wall and onto the ceiling, being slashed open repeatedly, screaming for her boyfriend. It's just a perfect set piece in so many ways. Yeah, that perfect mesh of childlike fantasy and pure, unadulterated slasher horror. And he just marries the two together perfectly. And obviously that was the first proper murder sequence of the film and of the entire franchise. And it paved the way for everything to come. I think for me, my favourite dream set piece of the whole bunch is where Nancy is falling asleep in class. And again, you've got this brilliant thing that Wes Craven does where he kind of melds the dream world with the real world, and you're never quite sure which you're in throughout the whole movie. As Nancy gets more and more sleep deprived and is living off coffee, she's kind of nodding off every few minutes, and we don't quite know ever whether she's conscious or unconscious. But anyway, there's this classroom scene where she's listening to something very boring in class, read by the teacher, who's played by Lynn Shay, who everyone will recognise from the Insidious movies. But anyway, she does, sure enough, fall asleep. Not that we realise it. And she suddenly hears something call her name. And she looks round, and next to her in the classroom is Tina in this body bag, and she's kind of upright, but she's in a body bag, and everything's kind of misty and hazy, and she is covered in blood, and it's the most weird, surreal, dreamlike, fantastical, and yet disturbing image. And it only gets more disturbing after that when she kind of follows this body bag into the corridor as it gets dragged along, leaving this trail of blood. And of course what that leads her to ultimately is down into the basement, which turns into the boiler room, which is Freddy's kind of lair, and that's their first head-to-head encounter. But it's just a perfect scene, absolutely creepy as anything, foreboding, imaginative, creative. If you ever let a child watch this who wasn't ready for it, I think it would give them nightmares for the rest of their life,
Hey, Nancy! No running in the hallway.
Okay, well, we've gotten this far. We've talked about the set pieces. We've talked a bit about the characters. We haven't talked about one massive character, and that is, of course, Freddy Krueger, played by Robert Englund. Now, Freddy Krueger, as we've mentioned already, he is this kind of shadowy figure. He's Fred Krueger in this. And of course, we all know how much Freddy Krueger evolves and changes throughout the series. He's always played by Robert Englund, apart from in the remake. You know, you've got one guy playing one character, one killer throughout, and that's very unique for the slasher genre as well. Freddy divides a lot of people. Some horror fans love him, some really hate him, find him really annoying. What is your opinion on Robert Englund and Freddy Krueger?
Robert Englund's performance is, you can't really compare it to anything, because you can't imagine anybody else doing it.
No.
Well, Jackie Earle Haley has done it, but it's who I think is actually friends with Johnny Depp in the 80s, so there's sort of a circular thing about it all. But he made it his own completely, and it's incomparable, really, that performance.
In the first film, he is absolutely designed to be terrifying, isn't he? He's this shadowy figure you don't really see much of. And then what changed over the next few years? It's crazy how much that figure changed.
And I can only speak through personal experience of being that 11-year-old boy watching it, thinking, I want to see more Freddy.
Right.
He's cool.
Yeah.
He's the great one. He's fun. You knew it was a movie, it wasn't like you were sort of hero worshipping an actual murderer.
No.
You knew he was a fictional character, and that's what you wanted to see more of.
Yeah.
And I obviously wasn't alone, because that's what happened. And he became this cult figure, and he became the breakout star. And Robert Englund, what I like about Robert Englund, and people have always said how amenable he is and amiable, is that he just went with it, and he made a lot of money out of it, and he had a great career out of it.
Yeah.
He's never been one of these people seems to have been annoyed by his success in one specific role, or only being associated with that. He has done other things, and he's used his name to get other things off the ground, and has sort of accepted it and been very happy.
He seems like a lovely, the nicest man in the business as well, doesn't he?
Exactly. And I did when Freddy vs. Jason came out, I interviewed him for that film.
Oh, great.
And exactly that. I'd read that he was smart, friendly, the complete opposite of Freddy Krueger, and he was all of those things. And you just think, he couldn't happen to a nicer guy.
And they had the amount of, I suppose all actors face this a little bit, but the amount of questions that he must have been repeatedly asked over the last, and the amount of impressions, or do the voice, or do the laugh, or whatever.
Can you do my voicemail message for me?
Yeah, exactly. It's so funny.
It's what made the films, the success that they are. I suppose that if we're looking for deeper messages, there must be something in there about our love of anti-heroes and our love of people upsetting the system. I remember from around the same time, of course, there was the Terminator, and the Terminator in the first Terminator film is a bad guy, and is the one they're running from. But we all loved him, and he became the hero.
Yeah.
There's sort of scenes of him shooting policemen and everything, and I remember at university sort of studying these scenes, going, "This is great because he's defying the system, and he's a rebel, and that's why people love him, because he's anti-establishment." And I suppose you can argue the same for Freddy Krueger. I mean, no one would actually want to be haunted by him, but as a moviegoer, you like he's
the ultimate anarchist.
He is, As a moviegoer, you like his anarchy, and you like the fact that he just doesn't give a shit.
Yeah.
And in the first one, actually, throughout all of them, but if we're talking specifically about the first one, he's pervy.
Yes.
I mean, there's the famous bath scene where the knife comes up through the water between Heather's legs when she's in the bath.
Yeah.
And also the tongue through the phone, it's like he's just sort of...
There's a lot of tongue action.
Yeah. It's always like he's trying to sully the sort of virginal, pure woman in it. He's disgusting.
Yeah, and it is really, again, it's clever, the way that it works, because there is this real innocence to the story. Like this, the sort of last act when Nancy wants to get him and she's setting booby traps around the house, and that really feels like something out of a kid's film. And then like you say, you've got this leery man trying to stick his tongue down her throat constantly. It's bizarre.
It is bizarre. And I'm just again trying to speak from personal experience and remembering back to when I watched it.
Yeah.
And so wondering if I was ever scared of him. I think I was scared of the concept.
Yes, that's it.
But was I actually ever scared of him? And I'm not sure if I was. I think I was probably scared of going to sleep and something happening to me when I was asleep, but not specifically Freddy.
No.
And actually, the very fact that he is Fred Krueger in the first one, but became Freddy, which is a much more jovial, friendly nickname.
It says
that
it all.
shows,
It says it all.
He's our mate.
This is it, Jennifer. Your big break in TV. Welcome to prime time, bitch.
I mean, I wonder what Wes Craven must have thought as his character got changed. I mean, the inspiration for A Nightmare on Elm Street, as I mentioned, the idea of the story came from real life news snippets that he had read about children dying in their sleep from bad dreams. But the actual character of Freddy Krueger is something that he kind of based on something that terrified him as a child. Wes Craven was a little boy and he was in his bedroom and he couldn't sleep, and he looked out the window. He heard somebody outside. He heard some rustling in some bins, and he opened his curtain and it was nighttime, and he looked down onto the street, and there standing in the street under a street light was this man. It could have been, I think, some sort of vagrant or homeless man, just sort of wandering about or rummaging about, and he was wearing this kind of dirty old sweater and a dirty old hat, and he was kind of skinny looking, and Wes looked down at him, and this guy stared right back up at Wes, into Wes's eyes. And Wes Craven said he never forgot that. He never forgot that man that looked at him and absolutely chilled him to the bone. And absolutely, that was the real inspiration for Freddy Krueger.
One of the deepest fears of any critter, and certainly of human beings, is being opened up. That the skin is so thin, and it takes so very little to spill us out into the world, and our existence literally ceases at the merest opening. So it's important in a way in a horror film to deal with that reality, and I think that's why horror films so often go down to a slashing instrument. It is because that is the primal fear.
For me personally, Wes Craven is probably my favourite ever horror director. And I think he knows a lot about fears, about people's real fears, what they are, what they mean, and how to tap into them. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, you've got it's like he created the quintessential 70s horror movie with Last House on the Left, and also with The Hills Have Eyes, actually. These two incredibly nasty, grainy, scuzzy 70s exploitation movies that perfectly capture that kind of American independent horror cinema of the 70s, And then you've got A Nightmare on Elm Street, which we have been saying it feels like the most quintessential 80s horror movie. And then, 10 years after that, he made the quintessential 90s horror movie with Scream, which is the movie that launched everything when it came to 90s slashers. So 3 consecutive decades, he not only managed to kind of nail the zeitgeist, he also managed to terrify 3 different generations and create 3 just complete classics, really, that are so of their time, but are also so timeless. So, and I think when you look at other people like John Carpenter, George Romero, Tobe Hooper, they all had their time, they all had their peak, and then their career took a downward turn. With Wes Craven, he pretty much kept it consistent.
Coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door.
I wonder how he felt about the way in which Freddy was changed, because really he only did number 1 and then he came back for New Nightmare, where it was almost like, I want to claim Freddy back.
Yeah, well, I think that was what he wanted to do, wasn't it? And make a comment about what Freddy had become, which is what New Nightmare does. Yeah. And he also looks slightly different, doesn't he, New Nightmare? He's got a different outfit and things like that, which I think were probably more what he intended, what Wes Craven intended. Yeah. So it's like he did want to reclaim him. Yeah. And also, of course, I'm pretty sure Wes Craven didn't make huge amounts of money from this because
he got screwed a bit, didn't he?
He got screwed a bit, yeah. So it's not like he could even say, oh, well, I don't mind that much because it's making me loads of cash. It wasn't even doing that. So he was seeing his vision changed by other people. So I think he tried to reclaim that a bit in 1994. You look at other things Wes Craven has made, and he certainly never seemed like the guy who wanted his horror films to be kind of cuddly and friendly. So I suspect he wasn't that.
Yeah, absolutely. Chuffed. Yeah.
I want my mother and friends again.
What?
I take back every bit of energy I gave you. You're nothing.
And how do you think the film has aged now then? I mean, looking back at it now, what would you say? I mean, would you still recommend this movie to people, to new audiences?
I would recommend it as historically important.
Yeah.
To be honest, I don't think artistically it's aged that well.
No.
Those key horror scenes I've mentioned still have some power. I think the scenes in the real world have less power. I think the music's dated a bit. Some of the acting is dated a bit. So just a casual film fan would probably go, this is a bit rubbish
a bit
now.
naff.
Yeah. But that's, you can't deny the importance of the film. And so if you want to explore the history of horror movies, absolutely, you have to see it.
Yeah, it's key, definitely. And do you think there's life in the franchise still? I mean, will Freddy ever come back, I wonder?
I mean, Michael Bay did his best to screw it up with the remake, didn't
like
he?
Him.
Yeah. So that remake was what, 4 or 5 years ago now. Will it ever come back? I mean, it's an amazing character. On the face of it, I can't see why not, because he's an amazing character, and there'll be a whole generation of people who haven't seen the originals, and it's a new thing to them. It'll be, as happens with remakes. You just need to find the right person to play Freddy. Robert Englund is the right person, but whether he would want to do more or whether a studio would want him to do more, I don't know. But that's the key. He has to be shot in the right way and written in the right way. And I don't think that the last version with Jackie Earle Haley, as good an actor as he is, they really got that.
No, they missed something there, didn't they? As they have done with a lot of these remakes, Rob Zombie's Halloween. And it feels like they've all kind of missed the point, really, of what those originals were good for,
Yeah, and of course you're trying to we're talking as people who've seen the originals, maybe grew up with some of the originals. So, but I'm sure there are lots of people who have only seen Nightmare on Elm Street, the recent version, and maybe you like that, which is fine. But if you are remaking iconic stuff, it's a hiding to nothing. I always say remake stuff that didn't work the first time around, make it better. That's why I like the Hulk remakes. I mean, it took him a while to get it right, but it's like, well, why not? Because if you're getting it wrong the first time, have another go and try and make it better.
Absolutely. Sometimes there's a reason to remake something. And
I know that the money people in Hollywood don't necessarily want that, because if people associate it with a film that didn't work the first time, they're going to go, well, why should I watch it again? But artistically, surely it's much better to remake something that was crap and make it better.
I agree. And also, it does feel like such a brilliant premise in that first Nightmare on Elm Street film that wasn't really ever done justice again. And it does feel like you could do more good stuff there with kind of dream sequences. It's kind of meshing kind of surrealism almost with slashers. And that's a cool idea.
Yeah. Let's get Guillermo del Toro to make it.
Yeah.
Because he can do that pretty well.
David Lynch.
That would be amazing. Yeah. I mean, certainly with the technology that's out there, they could do it. Not that I would want it to be overly CGI, but you could have some fun with that. So it's an amazing premise, and it's not like sleeping has gone out of fashion. You know, it's still the most important thing that most of us do every day.
That's it.
So but it's casting would be critical.
Yeah. Absolutely. Brilliant. James, thank you so much for joining me.
An absolute pleasure.
And that is it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest for this week, James King. What a pleasure it was to have Radio 1's James King discuss movies with me. I mean, seriously, 13-year-old me would have been really, really fucking chuffed at that. So yeah, that was a good time. Thank you so much for listening to that discussion. Now, you may have been wondering where our discussion of the sequels was. With Friday the 13th and with Halloween, we kind of discussed the entire franchise. Well, with A Nightmare on Elm Street, we're going to talk about the sequels as we go over the next couple of weeks. So don't worry, I will be talking about such absolute gems as Dream Warriors and such absolute stinkers as Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. So we will be getting to that in time. Please do get in touch. Give me your feedback. I want to hear what you think of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Are you pretty nonplussed about it like James King is? Or are you a mega fan like I am? Because I think it's a masterpiece. Please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, or you can tweet at evolutionpod, or you can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/evolutionofhorror. If you get a chance, then please do drop me a rating or review on iTunes. It's really, really helpful. It helps me sort of get noticed by new listeners. Last week, once again, for the second time since the podcast has launched, we got put on the iTunes front page, the featured section, which really is quite a big deal for new podcasts, and it makes a massive difference to download figures. So, you know, and that's all down to the attention that the podcast gets from ratings and reviews and that kind of thing. So thank you so much for everyone who has left me a review so far. And if you haven't yet and do get a spare minute, I would really, really appreciate it. So thank you. Okay, next week. Well, we're in a bit of a funny time now in the evolution of the slasher. We had the slasher boom of the 80s, and we had the monumental Nightmare on Elm Street. But what happened after that? Well, what happened after that was, frankly, pretty terrible. The slashers went on a very slow decline into the late 80s and early 90s. And rather than skip over this period altogether, I've decided we are going to focus on it. So next week is going to be all about the decline of the slasher. So much like last week's episode with Michael Blythe, next week is going to be a spoiler-free episode. I'm going to be joined by critic, writer and horror movie fanatic. I mean, the amount of movies he's seen puts me to shame. Brad Hanson. Brad has drawn the short straw. He is the one that's going to have to sit and wade through all of the worst movies of the late 80s and early 90s with me. But because he is such a film nerd, he has seen pretty much all of them. So it kind of saved me a job. So I will be joined by Brad next week, and we will be talking about, amongst others, movies like The Leprechaun, movies like Child's Play, and movies like Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. So stay tuned for that. I think it should be quite a fun episode. Thank you so much for listening, and join me next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.